Okay, so for your very first watercolor painting, we're going to play on the qualities of watercolor and do what I call going with the flow. So we're not going to be fighting the media, we're going to be exploiting the qualities of watercolor. So we're going to be doing this creating non-representational painting. So we stretched our watercolor paper, and then you were supposed to create some sort of background using some of those advanced techniques. So things like wet on wet, salt, plaster wrap, drip, rubbing alcohol, or using paper towel. And then we're gonna let the paper dry. So once we are letting that dry, we wanna think about how we're going to use the principles of design. So we can use these different principles to create an interesting, unified, special, dynamic painting. So we're going to look at some examples by some famous artworks of these different principles and see how they use them. The first one is balance. That's a sense of equilibrium, making sure that we've used the entire surface, but that it isn't just based on symmetry. So, exactly the same on both sides. We want to have emphasis. So, but this image by Calder, you can see that your eye is drawn to that red spiral because the color is dominant, the color is warm, and the color is bold. Contrast would be juxtaposing elements. So in an example like this, Mondrian used the big red square and counterbalanced it with the blue and the yellow rectangles. Rhythm would be repetition of various elements. Notice how rectangular elements are repeated over and over again in an irregular pattern to create a sense of movement. Pattern would be a repetition that you would see over and over and over again. This Jasper Johns creates an overall pattern. I'd suggest in your finished painting not to make it look like wallpaper like this one. Unity is the sense that everything belongs together. It could be unified in color, it could be unified in shape or line. And the variety would be exploiting the differences. So even though it's got unity because it's all circles, notice how the circles are different colors, different sizes as they move around the composition. Proportion would be looking at relationships of sizes. Notice how these rectangles are all different sizes. So not having everything the same is always more interesting than when everything is equal. So in your sketchbook, what I want you to do is to make sure you write down the qualifications for the assignment. You must create a textured background, which most of you have already done. You must select a shape, and that shape can be organic or man-made. And what I want you to do is to overlap those shapes, layer those shapes, break apart those shapes, and alter their sizes. You want to create a composition using those principles of design we just looked at. So plan it out on your sketchbook, maybe use some tracing paper over your background to plan out your idea before you start to draw it or paint it. You want to create a limited palette, so make sure you select the color scheme and try it out in your sketchbook before you've started to paint to see how those colors will layer and react to one another. Make sure that you have a range of value and tone, so you don't want everything to be the same value of red or value of green. You want to have a range from light to dark. And then you can use a color scheme if you choose to, but if you decide not to use a standard color scheme, it still should be selective. You want to use the different watercolor techniques. Now, I don't want you to use every single one we've practiced, but you want to use at least 2 or 3 of them. So focusing on gradiated washes, not just doing flat washes, wet on wet, using some of the masking techniques, using some of the textures. And think about what you can do to play and expand upon the quality of watercolor. How can you layer? How can you dissolve imagery? How can you fade it? How can you show transition? How can you make new shapes? So let's see some examples of this, right? So notice how they're using circles and they're layering the circles and they're using color to emphasize those circles. Once again, circles. Here we got triangles. Notice how they're layering on top, starting light and gradually working dark. Oh, too fast. Here's the one that's on the slide. Notice how it drips, and it's okay. We're going with the flow. Here we have our rectangles. Now this one has more than one shape, but notice the balance. This one has some really cool masking. So they used the Frisket film to create those white triangles that you see on the right. Even if it's minimal, it still can be kind of interesting. So here we have circular shapes, and they exploited that circular shape with splatter. Some of these are not my examples, but they came from online. And you can see how intricate you can get with Frisket and detail brushes. Okay, so that should give you at least an area to kind of go from. When you are sketching, keep it simple, and then we can get more and more complex. So work in your sketchbooks, coming up with some ideas, and borrow some tracing paper to figure out what you're going to put on top of that background.